I'll just start again. I'm Vivian Louie. I'm director of the Asian American Studies Program and Center at Hunter College, where I'm also a professor of urban policy and planning. Tonight, we're going to celebrate Asian American arts and activism with an exciting panel discussion, Beyond Representation, What the Image of Inclusion Conceals. I also want to recognize that this is Women's History Month in the United States, which is March, and Black History Month in February, which we just recognized last month. At the same time, we need to be in the present, sobering moment. Today is the 1-year anniversary of the March shootings in Georgia, resulting in 8 people dead, 6 of them Asian American women. Next month in April, we will mark the 1-year anniversary of the shootings at the FedEx ground facility in Indianapolis, where 4 members of the local Sikh community were among the 8 who died. You know, I wish I could say that the hate against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders has stopped, but I can't say that. As part of the work that I do, my current research also focuses on Asian American New Yorkers and civic participation. So as part of this work taken together, I get to speak at events like this that are hosted by other organizations. For instance, yesterday evening was Asians Fighting Injustice. Other times, the Asian American Studies Center at Hunter is the host, as in tonight. And as I prep for each event, I take as my charge the obligation to bring into view what's just happened, the most recent attacks, because these attacks keep happening as much as we wish that they would not, and as much as we understand that they should not. So just this week, a 67-year-old AAPI woman was attacked in the Yonkers, New York building where she lives. According to Jessica Zhao, who's the vice president of the Forest Hills Asian Association in Queens, New York City, which was founded by Edwin Wong, she said in her presentation at the end of January that about 2 persons on average have been attacked each week in our city. And that's probably an undercount. So the topic of tonight's discussion could not be more timely. A lot of the struggle has been about invisibility and lack of representation. You know, what happens when there is representation? In this case, in the arts. Does the work of inclusion still continue? How and why? Just a few words about Hunter College. You know, I'm so proud to share that Hunter College has CUNY's largest undergraduate program in Asian American Studies, recently serving 1,100 students, and has CUNY's longest continuously running program in Asian American Studies. And CUNY, the City University of New York, is the nation's largest public urban university. I'm always honored to give a shout out to our 21 courses and to our fabulous 12 adjunct faculty for teaching them alongside myself. I also want to give a shout out to our wonderful full-time faculty associates at Hunter in Asian American Studies, some of whom are part of our audience tonight and who really bring so much as well. I want to thank Gabriel Galindez, who does the behind the scenes work for Asian American Studies as he's doing tonight. And I wanted to thank the Hunter College Departments of English and of Art and Art History for co-sponsoring tonight's event. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists in alphabetical order and our event. So we'll start with Howie Chen, who is a New York-based curator engaged in collaborative art production and research. He is a founding director of Chen's, a townhouse gallery in Brooklyn, where he has held curatorial roles, also at the Whitney Museum of American Art and MoMA PS1. His writings have appeared in magazines such as Art Forum, Frieze, and Art in America. With artist Micah Tajima, he formed New Humans, a moniker for collaboration with musicians, artists, and designers. Chen is the editor of the anthology Godzilla, Asian American Arts Network from 1990 to 2001, published just last year by Primary Information. This is a comprehensive collection of writings, art projects, publications, correspondence, organizational documents, and other archival ephemera from the trailblazing Asian American Artists Collective that sought to stimulate social change through art and advocacy. He is currently on the faculty of the NYU Steinhardt School. Candice Chu is a professor of English, American Studies, and Critical Social Psychology at the CUNY Graduate Center. She is the author of The Difference Aesthetics Makes on the Humanities After Man and Imagine Otherwise on Asian Americanist Critique. She was completing a book of essays on pedagogy entitled The Disinterested Teacher, and her current research studies Asian racialization in the so-called Asian century. Currently executive officer or chair of the PhD program in English at the Graduate Center, she teaches in such subject areas such as race and aesthetics, decolonial and anti-imperial cultural studies, and feminist and queer of color critique. So Wan Guan is an artist who works in a range of media, including sculptural and video installations, animation, drawing, printmaking, and artist books. Her projects explore the interplay between making and writing, portraiture, perception, historical memory. They have been featured at Full House, Los Angeles, Triple Canopy Magazine, and the Poetry Project. She has had solo exhibitions at Galerie Simon in Seoul, The Kitchen in New York, Matrix Gallery, Berkeley Art Museum, and the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City. Her work has also been featured in many group exhibitions in the United States and abroad. As an educator, she has taught at Columbia University, the Cooper Union, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Vermont College of Fine Arts. She is currently a faculty member in the Graduate Fine Arts Department at Parsons The New School and a contributor to Four Columns magazine. Bakirathi Mani is a professor of English literature at Swarthmore College, a founder of the Tri-College Asian American Studies program. She is the author of Unseeing Empire, Photography, Representation, South Asian America, published by Duke University Press, and Aspiring to Home, South Asians in America, Stanford University Press. Her scholarship on Asian American literary and performance cultures has been published in the American Quarterly, Social Text, the Journal of Asian Americans, Diaspora, Positions, and Asian Diasporic Visual Cultures, and the Americas, among other venues. Mani earned her PhD in Modern Thought and Literature from Stanford University, her master's in Modern Indian History from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and her BSFS in Non-Western History and Diplomacy from Georgetown University. She is a curator with Independent Curators International. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Howie Chen. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us online today. I want to extend my gratitude to Vivian Louie and the Asian American Studies Program and Center for the invitation to assemble this panel around this complex topic during such an intense time in the world. I want to thank especially Candice Chu, Wan Guan, and Bakirathi Mani for your generosity and time for this conversation tonight. I've been looking forward to this meeting and can only wish that it could be a full-on symposium because there's just so much to share and to talk about together. It's an honor to be in dialogue with you, and thank you for your labor and care in your work. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining this meeting in New York City on the ancestral and unceded indigenous lands of the Lenape peoples, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. addressing structural indigenous exclusion and erasure is critically important, along with a commitment to actively work to overcome the ongoing effects and realities of settler colonialism. Okay. So I'm gonna begin with an introduction before we get into a discussion and individual presentations. At the beginning of the pandemic, when things were locked down in New York, I found myself at home and online speculating what might happen. This was the beginning of a hyper-anxious period when stories of scapegoating anti-Asian violence were beginning to emerge, along with other simmering social and political tensions in America, leading up to the Black Lives Matter uprising and other ruptures. At the onset of the pandemic, people in our community had a heightened awareness of how COVID-19 as a virus was being racialized as an Asian contagion and how it might play out for people identified as such. In New York City, the streets were empty, and each time I went outside, I had to mentally prepare myself. As I left my house masked, I often found myself thinking about the strange perils and contradictions of visibility in America. Around the same time, I began my deep dive research into the history of Godzilla, Asian American Art Network, which was a legendary art and social advocacy group that formed in the 90s in New York City to bring visibility to Asian Pacific American artists in museums, galleries, and wider culture. This group consisted of Asian artists, curators, writers who organized to stimulate social change through art. I was familiar with the history of the collective because I've known Godzilla members over the years from working in the art field. I also knew the important legacy of Godzilla was their success in bringing institutional visibility to Asian artists during the 90s, alongside other struggles for representation by other underrepresented people of that time. I became interested in how politics of representation manifests in the realm of the visible, how the struggle to be seen plays out in society and culture, and how visibility is made object in such forms as art. Drawing on institutional and personal archives and interviews, the research culminated in the publication of Godzilla Asian Art Network, which is this book here, published by Primary Information, which is an anthology chronicling the collective's extensive activities spanning over a decade during the hotbed of multiculturalism in America. Besides assembling an archive of materials to render the history of Godzilla, I was interested in the critical ideas underpinning the discourse of Asian American art and its relation to the historical and material production of the Asian American subject. Or more simply put, what are the stakes of Asian American art, and what exactly forms our knowledge of what Asian American is, especially in the context of aesthetic production? Much of our understanding of who or what is Asian American has been inherited along with other racial identities in America. They appear normative or even essential to our lived experience, despite their synthetic formation under colonial settler regimes. As much as we can conceptually understand race as a construction in Western society, the material and psychic experience of a racialized subject today seems all too real. So how do we reconcile this? And this is where critique comes into play, as a practice to take a critical view of social relations and knowledge formations at hand, and think of new emancipatory possibilities, free from certain kinds of determinism or governmentality. Critique is the deep questioning of reality that presents itself as natural and to propose other ways of understanding. Or as Candice Chu puts it, it is the ongoing practice and imperative to imagine otherwise. With the Godzilla anthology, I wanted the material to reflect this tension between the lived racial reality of the Asian American experience and the need to radically interrogate the identity narratives, politics of representation, and the desire for visibility within the apparatus of American society. In addition to assembling an archive of primary and secondary documents that chronicled the collective, I also wanted to map the critical genealogies that help us understand different frameworks and even doubts, particularly around the teleology of progress assumed in social representation in the art field. In the introduction to the book, I attempted to weave the collective's history with generative critique that has propelled discourse on the instabilities and contradictions in the concept of Asian American as a nation-bound racial category, overdetermined by narratives of belonging and existence. I approached the Godzilla project as an art curator with the purview that I could synthesize discourse, analysis, and methodologies across fields, including sociology, art history, political philosophy, and American studies. In effect, extending the work of the curator from the care of art objects to the care of knowledge objects. Thinkers that informed my research during that time and still include Hannah Arendt, Lisa Lowe, Stuart Hall, Karen and Barbara Fields, Luc Boltanski, Claire Jean Kim, Suzette Min, and Karen Higa, to name a few. Both Bakirathi and Candice's critical academic work was very much on my mind, in addition to Godzilla artists such as Sowon Kwon, who made ambivalence, place, and signification the subject of their artwork. By examining diasporic South Asian contemporary art and encounters with the work, Bakirathi Mani asked important questions such as, what is behind the desire to be visible and to see yourself reflected in visual representations, such as photography or other media? And why does representation never seem to be enough, even with increased visibility by all popular accounts in America? And what continues to produce this obsessive desire to be seen? The answer, of course, are complex and has to do with what Mani describes in Unseeing Empire as a specific mimetic relation between one's perceived identity and the visual object. That diasporic experience of seeing art is bound up in an insatiable desire to see ourselves and community reflected in the art and in the artist maker. She points out that the desire for representation is overdetermined by colonial visual regimes and demonstrates how photography in particular was used for documentation and surveillance of colonized subjects. Mani focuses on how artworks can, instead, question our desire to be represented by focusing on the failure of the image, and also how it can be a form of refusal of empire and its representational economy. She points to other modes of artistic representation, such as speculative, fictional, and abstraction, and how art can facilitate in, quote, developing practices of seeing that look elsewhere, outside the colonial archives that shape our very desire to see ourselves, end quote. Candice Chu's powerful work, Imagine Otherwise, interrogates our knowledge of Asian American. She asks us to consider, what do we need to do when our understanding of representation in America is based on a visibility politics that flattens difference in the name of intelligibility in the public sphere? Chu points to the instability of Asian American as a category and sign, and investigates the institutional structures that attempt to stabilize it as a knowable object. She calls for an active critical practice that does not assume a defined subject, to recast Asian American instead as a subjectless discourse, instead of one defined by a cultural nationalist framework dominated by America as its master signifier. For Chu, the aesthetic realm, through forms such as visual art or literature, can offer theoretical devices to understand and to denaturalize racial, sexual, gender, and national identities, and even to create counter-subjectivities that decenter Western liberal humanism, using post-colonial and transnational lenses, among other things. In this way, art can produce meaningful differences and create common and uncommon sensibilities towards new forms of political agency and ways of being together. And finally, Sowon Kwon's artistic practice has been described as an alternative form of self-portraiture, presented as a diffusion of perceptions and historical memories experienced across different media and spaces. Her recent work explores how language mediates relationships and reconfigures social hierarchies. In her S as in Samsung project, she examines the word Sam in its different cultural and linguistic contexts, from the Korean slang term of respect for a close elder to the distant associations with other people named Sam in American culture. She in effect short circuits sign and referent through wordplay to create new associations. In her ongoing interest in the function of the comma punctuation mark in her publishing and art projects, Kwon inaugurates a signifying chain with the most unlikely connections. For instance, connecting American imperialism in Vietnam to Sylvia Plath's death to Italian art. According to Kwon, the comma helps locate the terms on either side, which could stand for an ideal practice of negotiating the self. So tonight's panel, titled Beyond Representation, gives us an occasion to think about how visibility in the public sphere, whether it be in Hollywood or roles in government, can strangely obscure underlying structures that continue to produce the conditions for material, physical, and symbolic violence. Today marks the one-year anniversary of the tragic spa shootings in Atlanta, which resulted in the death of 8 people. It is an occasion to think about the deeper roots and forms of violence in expansive registers, to think about the collective pursuit of justice with others facing the same regimes of domination. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Candice Chu to kick off the presentations. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Howie. That was just a beautiful intro. And my thanks also to Vivian Louis and to Gabrielle Calendez, who I know is behind the scenes helping us to execute this today, and the Asian American Studies Center and Department at Hunter College. I'm really delighted to be here with you all. And thank you to everyone who created time to be here today. I know yet another thing on Zoom is not necessarily the most interesting or engaging, and so I'm particularly grateful for your company. I'm going to share my screen as we get going, and I'll talk about what you'll be seeing as I go on. Okay. So when we entered this mode of work, this remote mode of work, just about 2 years ago, I began asking in gatherings such as these to allow for a collective pause as a way of acknowledging and trying to be present to different gatherings, all the while being in the same physical space. In this pause, I ask us to remember those who may be physically absent, but who are nonetheless always with us. I mean in this pause to invoke not only our beloveds, but also our teachers and students, as well as those multitudes unknown to us personally, who have come before us and made this present, this gathering possible. I mean, of course, to refer to indigenous dispossession, which is the condition of possibility for the present. Like Howie, I speak to you from the unceded territories of the Lenni Lenape, who continue to work toward formal sovereignty, as well as to the histories of enslavement, exploitation, and exclusion that comprise our history. In this pause, I'm asking us to remember that we are always a crowd, even when it seems we are alone and individuated. The consideration of responsibility to this sense of crowdedness, or in other words, the consideration of mutuality, is part of where I go with my remarks today. I'm going to share with you images of 2 works. First, part of his brand new show on exhibit at the Talwar Gallery in New York City right now, by Ellen D'Souza, and this is what you're seeing right now. And the other, a photograph of an installation by Jean Chen, which captures one of the iterations of her Unraveling project that dates to 2006 to 2018. I've been thinking with these works as I've been trying to make sense of contemporary configurations of the Asian in the US political and cultural imagination. And it's some of that thinking I'll offer for today's conversation. So some of you will know that Ellen D'Souza was born in Kenya to parents from India and grew up in the United Kingdom. He has for the past several decades been in the San Francisco Bay Area. And like this current piece, Drift, which is a digital painting over a photograph he took of his father's bed upon his father's death, his work regularly evokes an archaeological sensibility that captures the thickness of the present, the ways that the present is constituted by everything and everyone that has come before. And as this image shows, contrary to the tidy ways we narrate history and biography, in fact unfolds in overlaps and fragments and indeed drifting ways. These images of Jean Chen's Unraveling, which I believe are from the Philadelphia Museum of Art installation in 2018, are likewise a rendering of time. Again, as many of you will know, a Korean American artist based in Brooklyn, Chen regularly works in this large scale format. This particular project involved asking for and collecting sweaters from Asian American arts and adjacent communities in a variety of US cities, which she then unraveled in part and reassembled into these web-like structures. It resonates for me as a realization of what I think of as the infrastructural work we do in connecting as people working collectively on studying the meaningfulness of the idea of the Asian American. This is for me very much, I think, in the spirit of Godzilla. The study of Asianness has for me long been a point of entry into figuring out how everything is entangled and connected, despite and against the manifold pressures on us to understand such categories of identity as discrete. So I'm inviting us to think with these works because for me, the beyond of representation is related to how art can defamiliarize the ways we conceive of Asianness and Asian Americanness, how it can interrupt the congealment of identity in singularly effective ways. If in its inception, as Howie's brilliant introduction to the Godzilla volume details, the horizon of such a collective was making the presence of Asian American artists and artwork known. Today, I wonder if we might not identify as a rendering of the urgent and ongoing need for Asian American art, the fact that they help us bring forward and amplify the worlds we wish to inhabit. In this view, every object holds in it the world out of which it emerged, and every object is itself part of a world it is ushering into being. Art, definitionally that which pushes beyond the ordinary, which punctures or expands or disrupts or defamiliarizes in some fashion, might in this regard be understood as the eruption or appearance or even just a glimpse of the non-ordinary world, one that exists in some however nascent form emerging into the present. Let me try to ground this all more specifically, and in doing so, get back more pointedly to the panel's organizing themes. As both Vivian and Howie's introductions noted, Asian Americans are all too visible right now as victims of anti-Asian hatred, as established quite compellingly by everything from the federal COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act to the Stop Asian Hate rallies unfolding across the nation, and of course, the ubiquitous videos of Asian people under assault. I have been trying to think and write through what to make of the fact that Asian subjects have been so firmly and decisively become the exemplary figures of hatred in US culture and politics. I cannot but fixate on the slogan, Stop Asian Hate, which shuttles the Asian between the figure of hatred and the figure who hates, which seems exactly apposite or appropriate, a way of capturing the ambivalent position of the Asian subject in the US sphere. And I worry too that within the symbolic economy within which Stop Asian Hate has meaning, the choice we're given is to aspire to the love of the nation expressed through protection. What embraced by the nation obscures, of course, is its own history of producing the nation through the racialized exclusion endemic to US national identity formation. The mobilization of the rhetoric of hate, I submit, is very much a part of the politics of representation through which the nation promises incorporation. Various states and the federal government have responded to this spate of violence against people of Asian descent by using it as an opportunity to expand the kind of surveillance capacities intensified after 9/11 and endemic in the policing of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian communities across the nation. Against this scene, it is necessary to ask toward what ends is the demand for visibility around such violence not only being mounted, but in fact realized. Let me return briefly to D'Souza and Chen by way of closing these opening remarks to say something about how they might help us dwell in the beyond of representation in this event's title, and toward the ends of interrupting the congealment of Asian American as the exemplary figure of hatred and violence. D'Souza's work reminds us of the importance yet and still of insisting on denationalizing knowledge practices and in allowing the instability of the meaning of Asian American to come through, which for one thing immediately throws into relief the inadequacy of hate and love as a means of conceptualizing racism. Standing alongside his piece, we might note that Stop Asian Hate is rendered nonsensical when we think about something like the relationship of Taiwan to China, or the treatment of Chinese international students in South Korean schools, or the relationships between Filipino and Filipina labor-driven migrants to Qatar and Israel and other countries of the Middle East, and so on. Critical acknowledgement of the continuing stronghold of exclusionary nationalism prompts us to hold nationalism center stage in theorizing and enacting anti-racist work. Second, and now standing with and within Shin's piece, I'm inviting us to ask, what would it take for the term and category Asian American to refer to solidarities across space and organize around a common project of de-imperialization and decolonization? What would it take for it to be a term that refers to strategies of world making and not one that exemplifies subjugation, hatred, or even model minority status? What art and aesthetics, pedagogies and practices, curricula and institutional arrangements can and do precipitate and enact these possibilities, crafted through acknowledgement of entanglement and toward the ends of mutuality? We will, I think, need to unlearn the grammar of possessiveness that sorts knowledge and social problems into a variety of interests assigned to particular groups. When we understand anti-Blackness and settler colonialism as the grounds upon which the present is built, as well as the imperial contestations unfolding trans-Pacifically, and the impact on the Congo of the mining necessary to produce vehicles sold as the solution to climate catastrophe, and the droughts caused by toxification at the hands of competing now post-industrial nations as conditions underlying war making across the planet as food and water sources disappear, and so on and so on and so on. When we understand and experience all this as Asian American history, we begin to understand how the study of Asian racialization serves as a particular point of entry into apprehension of the world writ large, and can understand the task of lifting up and amplifying the work that helps bring forward that sensibility.
Thank you, Candice. Next up is Bakirathi Mani with opening remarks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Howie and to Vivian for bringing us together, to everyone who's working behind the scenes and everyone who's taken a couple of hours off on an extraordinarily beautiful spring afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to being in conversation with all of you, and especially with Candice and Sowon, whose work I've learned a great deal from. In my remarks today, I want to consider how the social and political context of anti-Asian racism shapes the ways in which Asian American viewers identify with and engage with artwork. I'll be speaking about contemporary photographs of anti-Asian violence and Asian American protest in terms of how these images might create a new dialogue on race and representation. My recent book on Seeing Empire, Photography, Representation, South Asian America considers how visual representations of Asian Americans created by South Asian American artists are haunted by histories of empire, including empires not of our own time. Looking at works by artists including Seher Shah, Gauri Gill, and Anu Matthew, and it's Anu Matthew's work Fabricated Memories on the top right there, I emphasize how each of these artists create artworks that incorporate, disseminate, and reconfigure photographic images from a variety of archives, including colonial British archives and 20th century settler colonial US archives. I also explore the museum context within which these artworks are displayed, and the curatorial narratives that shape how, as Asian American viewers, we produce relations of identity with the artworks. So some of the questions that I ask in Unseeing Empire include, what does it mean for racialized immigrants to see ourselves represented, particularly in photography? How do we establish relations of identity with the photographic object? And why do we feel so drawn to images that we think represent us? And what do we do with visual artworks that repel us or that alienate us? In the years since the publication of my book, I've been moved to consider how, as Asian Americans, we look at photography that documents current incidents of anti-Asian racism. This includes photojournalistic coverage of the mass shootings in Atlanta, which, as Vivian reminded us, occurred a year ago today. It also includes photographs taken by bystanders on cell phones and on surveillance cameras of individuals who've been violently assaulted, for example, on New York City's subway, and brutalized on the city's streets. In collaboration with my colleague Suzette Min at the University of California at Davis, we've been working to think through these photographs of anti-Asian violence, hard as it is to keep looking at them. Many of these images are not what we conventionally understand as fine art. but the photographs acquire a dense aesthetic and political value. In my view, these contemporary images are haunted by past histories of anti-Asian violence. That is, the current photographs are part of an unending open archive of anti-Asian violence. For example, the mass shooting at a FedEx facility in Indianapolis on April 15, 2021, left 8 people dead, including 4 Sikh Americans, Jaswinder Singh, Jaswinder Kaur, Amarjit Kaur Johal, and Amarjit Sekon. In this photograph, which is titled Members of the Sikh Community During a Vigil for the Victims of the FedEx Shooting in Indianapolis, Saturday evening, which was taken by AJ Mast for the New York Times, a Sikh man stands with his eyes closed, looking down in solidarity with 3 other people. This single image contains at least 2 other photographs. The people to the right and left of the person in the turban hold a portrait of one of the murdered FedEx employees, Amarjit Sekon, which is a photograph taken from a family photo. The man's hands are empty, but his t-shirt holds another black and white photograph, and it looks like an image of 3 Black people, perhaps a reference to the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. Despite the density and the specificity of images that document the murder of South Asian Americans in Indianapolis in April of 2021, there's an uncanny quality of repetition that marks this archive. What we see emerging from Indianapolis in 2021 reproduces the photographs that circulated in the aftermath of the massacre of 6 Sikh Americans at a Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin on August 5th, 2012. It also replicates the sequence of photographs that proliferated after the death of Balbir Singh Sodhi in Mesa, Arizona, who was murdered in one of the first race-based hate crimes in the aftermath of September 11th, 2001. So first we see the images of the crime and its aftermath, then photographs of the grieving family, and then the protests that move Asian Americans to organize locally, nationally, and transnationally. Repetition structures the form, the content, and the sequence of the photographic archive in 2001, in 2012, and in 2021. From my perspective, mass photograph recalls for me another image taken nearly 20 years earlier by the Asian American photographer Corky Lee. In Lee's photo of Sikh Americans at a vigil in New York City after September 11, 2001, this is a vigil organized in response to Balbir Singh Sodhi's death, a young man drapes himself tightly in a US flag looking directly at the camera. Taken in the aftermath of these hate crimes against South Asian and Muslim Americans, the tight framing of Lee's camera, his portrayal of a dense crowd of Sikh Americans who gather in protest holding American flags, produces an image that insists on Asian American belonging to the nation. I'll note that the forms of Mast and Lee's photographs differ considerably. In Mast's image on the upper left, the lone male figure's eyes are cast downwards as if in prayer, and in Lee's photograph on the bottom right, the man who covers himself with an American flag insists on meeting our gaze. But I also want to point out that even as Mast and Lee differently frame their images, both do so by foregrounding the turban, the very object that led in part to the murder of Sikh Americans in Indiana, Wisconsin, and Arizona. That is, the visibility of Sikh South Asians as Asian Americans in both images is indexed by the very object that marks these immigrants simultaneously as terrorists, as patriotic citizens, and as targets of violence. How then can we work to see ourselves in relation to these images of Asian American protests and anti-Asian violence when the photograph itself can codify our position as racialized objects on display? I want to hold on to the capacity of the photograph to move us into action, to remind us of the fact that the image may yet surprise us. In her series, The Americans, the artist Gauri Gill suggests ways of seeing immigrants differently. A number of her photographs focus on Sikh Americans in the aftermath of September 11, 2001. For example, in this diptych, the left side is of a building under construction through which we see glimpses of brilliant orange foliage. The right side image depicts 2 Sikh Americans working on a rooftop, sheathed in flimsy plastic ponchos that fly away from their bodies and matching caps pulled over their turbans. The men work against the rain and the wind. What emerges across this diptych is not a portrait of Sikh Americans as terrorists or citizens or as targets. Instead, in quiet and quotidian ways, the image marks the ongoing labor of crafting and building community, work that remains partial and incomplete. One of the primary visual effects of being subject to anti-Asian violence is that artists, as well as viewers, are continually reinventing how we see ourselves, not just as objects, but as subjects of history. I'm curious to hear more about what it might mean for artists to create incomplete visual narratives of representation, and likewise what it might mean to curate and to consume such representations of Asian America. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bakirathi. Next up is Sowon Kwon with opening remarks too.
Thanks, Howie. Let me share my screen. Okay. Thank you, Howie and Vivian and everyone here for their interest and engagement. I had the idea of presenting 5 super short animations, kind of screen friendly, super short, but they span a bunch of years. So if I don't talk too much, I can get through all of them. I timed it cumulatively, they're about 5 minutes. So I'm not going to talk too much. I am going to show a reference image before I show the animation. And I will give you the date and title as appropriate. So here we go. First one. Oh, second one. This is an ergonomic template for the human figure, average female. I don't have an exact date for it, but the company that makes them and distributes them, they're still available. I mean, they're still in circulation. Pickett Chart Pack was established in 1949, and that's a pretty good date to kind of think about because ergonomics as a field of what they call human factors engineering kind of had a big boom after World War II. So a lot of this quote unquote science, the statistical science of taking body measurements for optimum efficiency with machines came via military technology. So the first animation is called, I'm looking up because I might have a bigger screen up there, was made in 1998, 99, a little bit around the time of Godzilla, a little bit after. It's called Average Female Hand to Mouth. It's on a loop, so. Stop. Okay. Next reference image. On the left, the New York Times, March 1st, 2020. And on the right, the New York Times, March 1st, 2020, a few hours later. Oops. This is 1991. Seeing Red also features a New York Times quote. It was in a Godzilla show called Dismantling Invisibility. It was made for that show. Also on a loop. Back when they had slide projectors, when we had slide projectors. Next reference image. This is an archival photograph of the dining room of one Frederick Leyland in London, and it shows a construction by Thomas Jekyll, an architect, and James McNeill Whistler's collaboration. It was constructed because Leyland had purchased Whistler's painting that you see on the right, The Princess from the Land of Porcelain, which was painted in 1863 to 65. And you can see this reconstruction at the Freer in DC right now. I made an installation based on that, based on the master, study after the master. You know, as a full-on installation people walk through, but recently I found this animation that I made at the time, which is so old that I couldn't put it into the Google. So I'm gonna just show it this way. Whoops. It's just 14 seconds. It's called Wainscot Peacock, 1993. Okay, back to where am I? Here. Okay. Next reference image. This is a work, one of a series of photographs by Felix Gonzalez Torres, called Untitled Natural History, 1990. I guess I have another reference image for this. If you know of this, sculpture at the Natural History Museum, which was taken down as of this year, there's actually a frieze that goes around behind the sculpture, and Gonzalez Torres had taken photos of what was in these inscribed tablets that most people kind of miss because of the sculpture of Theodore Roosevelt, which was a memorial to Roosevelt by James Earl Fraser, which was unveiled in 1940. And because of protests over many, many decades, it was taken down. It's to be housed at the Roosevelt Library I think in 2026. A couple more of Gonzalez Torres' photographs. This is a work, I'm just going to show a little excerpt. It's a text-based work. I did a lot of writing during lockdown. I made a kind of 7 days in the form of a horoscope of horoscopes. This is just an excerpt I'll show. It's called Untitled Memorial Days. Okay. Last reference image. This is a landing page website for a museum. It happens to be the Museum of Chinese in America. Could be a lot of other museums. I had occasion to land on that page quite a bit. Bakirathi mentioned Corky Lee. He passed away when I happened to snap this screenshot, and this is the new branding identity if you looked on their website now. And the last animation is called Wooden Tan, which I made last year.
Can I just like stir fry these peppers, you think? I'll try that. Yeah. What do you think? Ask her. I think she should. She's old. She's like your age, my age.
Hi, could you all mute, please? Thank you.
That wasn't my audio, but it was kind of
I think she
interesting.
just found out like a couple days ago.
Okay. I think that's more than 7 minutes for me. So
She's getting any better. She already got better in like a day. Big. She has like real brain fog right now.
Well, thank you, Sowon. And I think the chance audio actually kind of vibes with the associative imagery that you presented us. So, yeah, I think thank you for those opening presentations. I want to just kick off. I feel like there's all these kind of tensions and dialectics afoot, and I just wanted to. So I feel like there's a space of theory and speculative possibility when we talk about identity and the unknown, or the generative possibilities of incompleteness. But then there's like, on the other side, we're pulled back to these kind of events and material conditions and situations. So my question to kick off the question, the Q&A period is in presenting new critical frameworks to understand our complex issue of politics of representation and identity, we're always kind of threading the needle, having to balance it with the dominant understandings of Asian American as a racial category. And even when we're looking at photographic images that Bakirathi is presenting, those are concrete, indexable, recognizable images. In the age of hashtag Stop Asian Hate and the mainstream celebration of Asian visibility in Hollywood, let's say, how do you, as artists, as academics, as people, how do you negotiate the important critical work that you do in your field, academia and art, with the urgency to create new positionalities and questions, with the crescendoing call to organize behind Asian identity and hate discourse en masse in the US? And I only ask this because I myself have received many questions in this vein, in which tragic events such as anti-Asian violence seem to only confirm the existing politics of representation and narratives, and making it difficult to imagine otherwise. I'm curious to how you negotiate that, the kind of the toggling and the dissonance of those two spaces.
the way you describe toggling, I can identify. Of course, there are very distinct, differences between, what we're experiencing today versus what historically what has happened, and we ourselves, some of us are of a certain age where we've experienced things just because we're older. And I'm reminded of, it is super difficult because there's this sense that there's a kind of desire for certain subjects to perform a kind of otherness or perceived otherness, but it's a pretty narrow definition. And if you're don't do that, you make, it seems you I'm fumbling. This should be easier to talk about, but it's not. I guess I often wonder, who is that for? What is that that performance for? And sometimes it seems like, say in my case, my otherness, or something that I might endure that others might not, there's a danger that it becomes some kind of entertainment almost, and I'm not really up for that. So it's hard, like you have to do this double work of, is that going to fulfill that function? And if it does that, then what does that do? Because sometimes maybe that's useful to get people off your back, and other times it just feeds into business as usual. So things haven't changed all that much. Some things are very different, but some things are very, very similar. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think this makes more sense.
That's
I mean, I think, Sowon, the first animation that you showed us, the figure, average female figure, hand to mouth.
Yeah.
I think in a way, that's sort of how I have been imagining and thinking about and responding to, in fact, the kind of demands for a certain kind of performative grief, right? Or performative identification even. I think probably many of us who are identified as or identify as Asian American women got those calls on the heels of the Atlanta spa murders, are you okay? And it's like, what kind of collapses, elisions, identificatory essentialisms are happening that you are reading me into that scene, right? And reading out all kinds of other people and histories, including the histories of migrant labor and a diaspora that are putting certain people in those vulnerable positions and not me in a different kind of position, all those kinds of questions. There is something about like the figure that actually, I don't want to say that we kind of need to keep eating ourselves, right? Rather actually to sort of undo the idea that there is a fixity, right? That there is the average template.
Yeah.
That is a fixed template, and that we are all those kinds of uniform subjects. And, I mean, for me, a lot of really the only way I ever respond to things is to try to be teacherly, not in a kind of pedantic way, but that's as my own sense of trying to understand things. Why are these things happening, right? Not how do I feel about them or how do you feel about them, but rather what are the conditions that are making these kinds of incidents so spectacular right now, right? And it's too easy to point to, Trump, right? To say, actually, he started this, yeah? Because we know that the US nation state was capable of racism against Asian people since its foundation. So what we constitute as the violence that we're actually going to pay attention to versus the violence that has a different kind of temporality or different scale or has poverty, impoverishment as a form of violence, right? We're not paying attention to that nearly in the same way that we're paying attention to these. And I'm not at all suggesting that we ought not give as much tender care to the communities who are losing people, and at the same time to recognize that I think my job as a teacher, and I think a lot of the job of artists or the artwork that really speaks to me, is actually to stretch that time out, to allow us to think other thoughts rather than the kind of more immediate reactive ones. So I really love that animation for all those reasons. I mean, partly because it's so hard, right? It's such a hard history to sit with. But there's a playfulness about what you have done there, which allows us also to say, I'm still here, I'm still here actually able to do that work. And that seems really important too.
I just think there's all we have are templates. In some ways, all we have are templates. So what can we do with those? If this is the average female, you know, I'm just going to assume that's me, or I'm going to assume it's somebody that I know. And how can you push that form to make it speak? Because it is kind of a dark humor, I would say, but I appreciate that you said it's playful because I think it's pretty funny. I even think the last animation, which was kind of a surprise to me, that's also a kind of template. That's pretty funny.
Speaking of templates, and also I'm curious, I've been thinking about kind of the long tail of multiculturalism and its institutional logic that has perhaps, I think, I'm pretty sure it has extended to the present, despite the sharpened backdrop of a new type of nationalism that's spreading, regionalism and identitarianism. My question, I guess, is: can you give me a sense of how art continues to be a proxy for identity, especially for minoritized people, and how it continues to persist as representations for authentic subjects, always vying for participation in democratic space, American democratic space, to be part of America, to be American. And to bring an example in, I'm thinking about the Whitney Biennial, which is opening in 2 weeks. It's always kind of like always under a lot of kind of review and scrutiny. Among the artists that were chosen, 5 artists that were emblematic to the 1993 multicultural political Whitney Biennial are included in this installment. I've been wondering whether this inclusion, this is just a thought exercise. Is it a nostalgia for a simpler times American multiculturalism of the 80s and 90s, where it's about pluralism? It's just you're just adding on whatever seems to be missing, and then there's like kind of fantasy that at a certain point you'll reach full inclusion, or if it's about reconfirming the multicultural program as it was, it's just so. Yeah, in terms of Sowon, you said nothing has changed. I'm curious about kind of like what you're seeing in the realm of literature, photography, and art that might be symptomatic or a refusal of this kind of the multicultural legacy and program.
Can I respond to that, Howie, I just want to lift up my colleague, Suzette Min's work. She has this terrific new book called Unnameable. And it's really, I think, really speaks to this question that you're bringing up about like, why is, especially amongst Asian Americans, but maybe for racialized subjects more generally, like how does, as you say, art continue to be a proxy for identity? And, Suzette has worked as both a critic and as a curator. And one of the things that I'm really taken by in that book is how she thinks about like the project of curation as both like shaped by these kind of ideologies of multicultural representation, right? And then also tries to figure out ways in which artists work within those constraints, the constraints of curatorial narratives, but also push past it or create new kinds of curatorial logics, right? And so I just want to like think about your question. I'm just thinking out loud a little bit here, right? And I'm thinking about like, why do we keep insisting that seeing ourselves visually represented is like equivalent to seeing ourselves belong, right? So in the couple of photographs that I shared with you by A.J. Mast and also Corky Lee's photograph, right? The Corky Lee photograph very explicitly is about national belonging in that there's the American flag wrapped around the man, but then there are also people holding the American flag, like as teeny flags, but also like a kind of banner flag. So there's like many, many flags, right? And people wearing clothes, the colors of the flag, etc. So that's all about like, in that photograph, you can see like, it's art and it's also national belonging. And those two things are like made equivalent, right? And then in the A.J. Mast image, there's no such proliferation of American national flag, but the fact that this image is like in the New York Times and the way that it's like frame within the context of the story of the massacre in Indianapolis is about saying like, oh my gosh, these people are also American, right? So there's this really interesting way in which these like photojournalistic images, not fine, I mean, I'm not talking about fine art in this context, but these photojournalistic images, it's like it's like even when you see yourself violated and even when you see yourself made abject, like even that is good enough to say that you belong. Like, it's like you keep wanting to see these images, not you, me, or one, right? So I'm just trying to figure out like, what is that about? Where does that really intense desire to keep seeing yourself as if the more you see, the more you'll feel like you truly belong. So then, and how many times do you need to do that? Because you're actually not getting any closer, right, to belonging. So that idea that of multicultural representation is, I mean, I think so many people, Candice included, right, and Sowon's work, like it's a lie, but we keep believing in it. That there's some kind of narrative framework that's going to make us feel whole, like a visual and narrative framework that's going to make us feel whole. I'll stop there.
I think that's, I guess I'm thinking about, you know, Summer Kim Lee's work or Jose Munoz or Christine Yao's recent work called Disaffected, you know, where you fail to map into those desires, right? I don't particularly, I'm not called in those ways in depending on the image, and that's probably true for everyone, right? So there's something, it seems to me like the institutional demands and the kind of, you know, Howie, when you were asking that question, actually, I kept thinking, well, it's actually the museum and the institution and the kind of marketing, right, that proliferates the categorical. So it becomes a commodity and an exchange. Yeah, there's money behind those kinds of categories. So our job, it seems to me, is to take the resources that are given to us through those categories, but not necessarily follow the dictates of what's expected of us. And this goes back to, I think, Sowon's opening, you know, kind of what she was saying before. And I think that most artists do that in some way. So in other words, like, I guess I would want to draw a distinction between what art does and then what our institutional categories do by classifying art in various ways. And the institutional demands and the protocols, I think, map onto what Baki is talking about in terms of the kinds of desires for things to be tidy and orderly and to kind of fall into place, because that is reassurance that the great American democratic experiment is working, despite all evidence to the contrary, right? And now there's a certain kind of willful ignorance, quite a powerful willful ignorance that has to be operational to keep insisting that multiculturalism is still going to be good, right? Because there's no evidence of it to the contrary. I mean, since the kind of establishment of multiculturalism as official discourse, and I'm drawing a lot on Jody Malamit's work here from the middle of the 20th century forward, we've seen greater impoverishment, deeper inequality, right? And absolutely mappable along the lines of race, gender, sexuality, and immigration status. So exactly as multiculturalism, you know, multiculturalism favors the current system. So I think one of the ways that I've been trying to work with this in terms of, you know, kind of a literature context or an English department, right, has really been to try to stop using the language of things like underrepresentation or diversity and to start using the construct of the address of the overrepresentation of whiteness, right? That's the issue. It isn't the underrepresentation of anyone, it's the overrepresentation, particularly in a school like CUNY at the Grad Center, right, which should be the most diverse place on the planet, demographically in every possible way. And it just isn't at the Grad Center. So, and that's a shift that Sylvia Winter's work affords, right? It's always thinking about overrepresentation. What is being overrepresented to me as the thing, as the figure, the template, right? And to try to push against that. How that intersects with where public conversation is, where public policy is, that feels to me like part of what you're asking, Howie, is like, how do we, you know, amplify that so that it's not just us doing this, but that it actually matters in a different way. And that, for me, I think like we just keep pushing that. We just keep pushing on that, you know, like we do our work. We just keep doing the work. And I do feel like these kinds of things are building infrastructure so that that knowledge gets conveyed, and then we can amplify it in all of the different sites that we exist in. That's my hopeful wish anyway.
Thanks, that is hopeful. I just have one quick question before we open it up. I know we want to hear from other people. I'm glad you brought up Suzette Min's book, Bakirathi, about the unnameable. She really calls for thinking about I think she draws on Rancière about thinking about the different sensibilities, and like also thinking about who and what governs the realm of the senses and stuff like that. I think that also meshes with Candice's kind of like work too. So I'm thinking about like what artists do. You just made a great distinction what artists do and what institutions, how they process it and make it an index for something else, right? A symbol for something else. So there's on the level of the artist, especially let's say an artist of Asian descent, let's say, like the challenge is kind of pushing to explore incompleteness, to create new associations, to test the aporia of abstraction and legibility. But I'm curious, maybe someone could talk about that, because as an artist, the risk, and this is the risk of illegibility as an artist is already built into the mode of being an artist. But let's say layered on top of this, like the kind of anxiety of visibility that has come with Asian American discourse is mapped onto it. How do you negotiate a type of illegibility that's based on your own agency, and one that is always kind of I guess foisted onto, and invisibility is always foisted onto artists of color, let's say.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think artists notice things and they generally trust that and try to point it out, try to find some form. And I really do take to heart what Candice is saying with respect to how whatever an artist does could be taken up in different ways by institutions, curatorial gestures. But I on a good day, I guess, I take heart in the idea that art has its own temporality and its own intelligence. And an artist can, if they can have that dance with that, whatever that they're doing or making, so that it becomes what it wants to become, it's gonna have its own, I can only hope, and I've seen this, art has its own pace. It has, materials have their own intelligence is the best way I could put it. So even if I think I intend something, and I can intend all I want, that may or may not be the meaning of the work over a kind of a longer trajectory. So I try to take heart in that fact that even if an artwork gets contextualized in a way that might be counter to what it's trying to actually do, it will have its day. That's on a good day. And yeah, I think artists have to be super agile if they, depending on where they want their work to go and where they want it to be seen. It's dicey. I don't have any formulas or answers, but I think it's a kind of trust in that what you've noticed is valid, and your work is to try to give it some kind of viability as a thing, and that's not easy. So I feel like artists, that's hard enough, but then we're often in our day, we're kind of put in this position where we have to also think through the larger framework. And these days I kind of feel like that's somebody else's job. That's the museum's job. That's the curator's job. That's the education people's job. And artists can, be as present as they can. But I think an artist's job is to trust what they're noticing and give it that viability as a thing. That's super hard.
I like how we're, when we're reaching for the words for the ideas, I think that is the ambivalence or the not knowingness that I think we're trying to intimate. So maybe we have about 8 minutes. We want to open it up to questions. Please punch in the chat any questions for the guests. There's so much to talk about, and like I said, it could unfold in a symposium format. I think I can imagine that.
I have a question. Howie, is that okay? And I defer, of course, if folks put the questions in the chat. So my question is, it's harkening back to the Godzilla art movement, right? Which is, of course, the subject of your terrific new book, Howie. But I wanted to get a sense from you for our audience, broadly speaking, like, why do you think Godzilla was successful in terms of pushing, right, for representation, for inclusion, to the extent that it was successful? So that's my first question. And then, why don't you take that on? And then if there's time, I'll ask my final question. Thank you so much.
I'd like to hear from all other people in the panel about that moment too, their take on the moment in the 90s. I think they were successful because of not only the legacy of the Asian American movement, but also on the backs, or on the knowledge and the efforts, not on the backs, on the knowledge and efforts of other activist activities, that whether it's gender, sexual equality, Black civil rights movement, all those insistences, all the tools, all the critical tools were manifested. Ken Chu, who was one of the founders, he was also an active member of ACT UP at this around the same time as the founding of Godzilla, and a lot of the open letter strategies to CC people in different institutions to make an Asian American issue a public issue in that way was largely because of the gay civil rights movement, and I think a lot of members were members of gender equality groups, Guerrilla Girls, and Pest, and all these other groups. So I think there was a lot of mingling, and this is what Candice was speaking to, the entanglements of these different struggles and the meshing of an insistence for social advocacy.
I was going to ask Vivian, what you mean by success, like successful? What are your thoughts?
That's a great question. Thank you. So, I mean, to me, just right now in the moment, success is change, right? I mean, activists advocate for a certain change. They have a certain goal that they wish to reach. So was the change met? And that leads to my second question, but I don't know if you want to, if our panelists want to, is it okay if I put out my second question? We have 5 minutes, so is it all right?
Howie, go for it.
Okay. So my second question is, and this really speaks to the heart of what you all brought to this, really thoughtful conversation, and so timely, in the sense of, so where do we go now? Right? I mean, what have we learned from the past to the extent that we achieve the goals or not, right? There are things to be learned when things are not achieved, when goals are not met. But where do we go to build a world where, I'm just riffing off of what you're, we're seeing ourselves, it's not equivalent to belonging, right? I mean, how do we build a world, and I'm riffing off of what you all shared, where these systems of inequality are dismantled, challenged, seen for what they are? Yeah, why don't I stop there?
Candice, I think you're muted.
I think, I just want to say quickly, this picks up on Sowon's question around the idea of success, right? When I think of Godzilla, and Howie, I know in the introduction, you're situating Godzilla both in the moment of its inception and kind of what comes after, but also giving us a sense of the conditions and the groups that preceded, right? So it's the precedential history. So these longer genealogies, these longer connections that in a literal way are bringing us together in this space right now, like some 65 of us, right? And so this isn't the solution. Like, we haven't yet finished the revolution so that we're done with racial capitalism or we're done with coloniality. But I kind of think that we're in process, and that has been in process. So we know from the moment that there was subjugation, there was resistance. We know that from the moment that there was an effort to get rid of a certain cohort, there was life kind of unfolding. And I think art is that in some ways, that it just keeps erupting, even when it has no business doing that, right? It is always erupting in some way. And I guess I want to leave open space for us to not think about success as kind of necessarily or only in terms of finite goals, but rather that we have created a space that Godzilla and everyone else who was working in that time to create institutional spaces for us to be able to have conversations like this, right? They did that work. And so we just keep continuing, right? So how much more space making and taking can we do? And I sound a little like trying to take over everything, and I don't mean it in that imperializing way, but just sort of like, there's systems that are trying to get rid of difference of women, of pretty much everybody in the room, right? They just haven't succeeded. And I feel like that's really important for us to amplify that. It isn't, I don't know, there's just something really crucial to me about not saying, because the formation left its formal organizational form, that it wasn't successful any longer, or that it, the duration means that it's not successful. Like, it's seeded so much for us that I feel this immense sense of gratitude generally for people who went before, for all the mistakes and all the kind of errancies that they produce, because I think we end up in those spaces, right? And trying to figure things out as we go. So I don't know why I'm feeling particularly like we have to kind of lift that stuff up, but maybe it is actually, I do know why, because so much right now, it is like, I don't want to be the exemplary figure of hatred. I think that we just, like, there's a lot of life stuff that's happening, a lot of playfulness that is dark humor that feels to me really important also to bring forward, even as we're standing up and saying, violence against anyone, right, is not okay in any form. So not just the spectacularized forms, but also the kind of understated ones. So
I just wonder if I can add on to that, what Candice was saying about art erupting everywhere, even when it doesn't have any business to do that. And Sowon had said so beautifully about how art has its own temporality and its own intelligence. And that's just really making me think about, like, maybe this is a moment of many, many sedimented moments, right? Where we can continue to remind ourselves that, like, maybe we can sit and, like, just speaking of photographs, for example, right? Like, maybe we can sit and figure out ways of differently reading these images that we see, instead of, like, in the context, for example, of contemporary Asian American violence, like trying to document it so profusely and fastidiously. Like the documentation is super important, but when the violence occurs, to turn towards your camera as a moment of documenting that, instead of like thinking about, okay, how do I see the thing? How do I see the thing, right? And how can I see it differently or in relation to past histories as a moment or a site to think about a different future, right? I don't know. I think it would be really, I think a lot of people are working on that. I'm working on that project.
Yes, no, thank you so much. There was one question in the chat that my colleague asked. I know we're going over, so so the question was from my colleague Virginia Tong: how can we mobilize Asian American youth to counter these stereotypes
Absolutely.
about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders? So if anyone wants to take that on, and then I'll close if that's all right.
Yeah, Mike, it's Virginia Tong. Thank you, Vivian. I spoke with some students, high school students. I think that's where change is going to take place. I wish we could take collectively what all of our presenters said today and make that part of a curriculum where students could see all the benefits and the insights that we all have, because these students, and I wanted to cry after I spoke to them, they said to me, they wrote to me and they said, oh, I didn't know it was okay to be Asian American. How detrimental can that be to them? All the insights that Howie and Bakirathi and Sowon had, my goodness, that would be the benefit. I mean, and Margaret Chen really was a spearhead of this. Margaret, I know you're there someplace. These are youth that need to go to college after high school, obviously. But what is happening in their minds at the time that they are developing who they are as Asians? Do they feel they could speak out? How do they speak out? What's acceptable? What's not acceptable? This is what we need to do. We need to be, I thank you, Vivian. We need to be much more proactive and give them very hands-on strategies of thinking how to be Asian American. Asian American Pacific Islanders, Asian Americans from all other countries. These students, I was really appalled. This is the Hunter College High School. These are supposed to be smart and intelligent students, but they didn't know what Asian American was all about. Vivian, I'd like to come to teach a course for you on this.
Always welcome you, Virginia.
I tell you, I feel, we have all of the presenters today have so much to give. And if we could take snippets and share that with the Asian youth, that would be great. We had Asian youth from Asia, of course, and from India. I mean, this was wonderful. And this is what we need to do. To keep it up here is one intellectual activity. How do we hand it over to them?
Well, is it all right if I take that on and then I want to, in deference to our amazing panelists. And,
I know it. I
want to make sure that we close. And so, so there are, of course, movements that are underway. I'm sure everyone in the Zoom room knows this, to have Asian American Studies curriculum, right? Asian American Studies, Pacific Islander curriculum, ethnic studies curriculum, in not only higher education, but also in PK through 12 public schools.
Exactly.
Right? Because that's where most of Americans go to school, in public schools. So, so certainly, I think that there's a lot of dynamism around that, and also around the question that Virginia raised, which is, I mean, that it's okay to be
Yeah.
Asian
They don't
American.
know that it's okay,
Under,
Vivian.
and you could say that it's okay to be a lot of things, right? Based on what our panelists have shared with us today. There's so many things that are seen as not okay as being in our world. But I wanted to just take this time now, if that's all right, to thank our panelists, to thank Howie and Sowon and Baki and Candice. That's how you're appearing in my screen. So to thank you all for being with us today and sharing these incredible insights, so thoughtful, so moving and meaningful, and for being with us today on a hard day, but also a good day. So thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for joining us, and have a good evening and take good care. Take good care. Thank you so much.
Yeah.